Welcome to Some TV Movie Channel, your home for amazing movies and non-stop entertainment. Get ready to enjoy blockbuster hits, timeless classics, and exciting stories from every genre. Whether you love action, drama, comedy, or adventure, there's always something to watch here. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest uploads. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the movie experience with Some TV Movie Channel. Mr. Harrigan's Phone is a 2022 American supernatural coming-of-age horror film written and directed by John Lee Hancock. It is based on the novel of the same name by Stephen King, from the collection If It Bleeds. The film stars Donald Sutherland, Jaeden Martell, Joe Tippett, and Kirby Howell-Baptiste. The story follows Craig, a young boy who develops a strong friendship with retired businessman Mr. Harrigan. Their connection takes an unusual supernatural turn after Craig receives his first iPhone, while Mr. Harrigan gets one as well. Even after Mr. Harrigan dies, a mysterious bond between the two continues through their phones, one of which is buried alongside him. Mr. Harrigan's Phone was released by Netflix on October 5, 2022. And received mixed reviews from critics. The story begins in 2003, when young Craig meets retired businessman John Harrigan after the death of his mother, Joanna. Craig is instructed to visit Harrigan 3 times a week simply to read to him. Over the next 5 years, the two gradually develop a close friendship. As a teenager, Craig starts high school and becomes close to his teacher, Miss Hart, who helps him when Kenny Yanko, a school bully, tries to intimidate him. Around the same time, Craig wins $3,000 from a lottery ticket given to him by Harrigan and receives his first iPhone for Christmas. This seemingly simple gift eventually becomes the beginning of a mysterious supernatural connection that continues even after Harrigan's death. Craig buys a phone for Mr. Harrigan despite the elderly man's initial resistance to new technology. Surprisingly, Harrigan grows to enjoy using it. When Harrigan eventually dies, Craig is devastated by the loss of his friend. At the funeral, Craig secretly places Harrigan's phone inside his coffin. Later, an associate of Harrigan informs Craig that he has been included in Harrigan's will. Craig is to receive $800,000 in a trust fund to support his future education and his dream of becoming a writer, a career he had previously discussed with Harrigan. As a gesture of gratitude, Craig calls Harrigan's phone. The following morning, he discovers an unusual text message from Harrigan. Craig's father dismisses it as nothing more than a technical glitch with the iPhone. Craig tries to move on with his life. He attends a dance with his crush, but the evening takes a dark turn when Kenny attacks him. Kenny accuses Craig of reporting his drug dealing activities at school, which eventually led to Kenny's expulsion. Later that night, overwhelmed by frustration and sadness, Craig calls Harrigan's phone again. He tells Harrigan what happened and admits that he is afraid the situation will never end. Craig wishes that Harrigan was still alive so he could give him some advice. The following day, Kenny is found dead after apparently falling from his bedroom window while trying to sneak out. Terrified by the coincidence, Craig visits an Apple store, upgrades to a newer phone, and puts his old device away. Craig eventually graduates from high school and leaves for college in Boston, where he plans to study journalism. While there, his father calls with devastating news. Miss Hart has been killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, while her fiancé Tilda Copyright is left hospitalized. The driver, Dean Whitmore, is sent to rehabilitation rather than prison. Craig is furious when he learns that Whitmore had previously been caught driving under the influence, had a suspended license, and was carrying an open container at the time of the accident. Angered by the verdict, Craig returns to his room and uses his old phone to call Harrigan. This time, he explicitly wishes for Whitmore to die. Craig later learns that Whitmore has been found dead in his shower. He drives to the rehabilitation center and bribes a worker for information about the apparent suicide. He is told that Whitmore swallowed shampoo and a piece of broken soap. Craig is disturbed when he discovers that the soap was the same brand used by Miss Hart. Even more unsettling, Whitmore's suicide note contains lyrics from Tammy Wynette's song Stand By Your Man, which is also Harrigan's ringtone. Overwhelmed by what he has discovered, Craig breaks down and returns to his hometown. There, he remembers opening a secret closet that Harrigan had once refused to let him enter. After Harrigan's death, Craig discovered that the room was actually a shrine dedicated to Harrigan's late mother. Craig visits Harrigan's grave and apologizes for the messages he sent. He begins to believe that Harrigan's strange texts are actually his way of asking Craig to let his spirit rest and to stop living in the past. Harrigan wants Craig to move forward with his own life. After leaving Harrigan's grave, Craig visits his own mother's grave and collapses in tears, asking for forgiveness. He then rushes to the town quarry and stands dangerously close to the water's edge, contemplating what he has done. Eventually, Craig throws his old phone into the water. However, he cannot bring himself to do the same with his new phone. As he walks away, he quietly reflects that when his own time comes and he is buried, he wants his pockets to be completely empty. In July 2020, Netflix acquired the film rights to Mr. Harrigan's Phone, with Blumhouse Productions and Ryan Murphy attached to produce and John Lee Hancock set to write and direct. In October 2021, Donald Sutherland, Jaeden Martell, Kirby Howell-Baptiste, and Joe Tippett joined the cast. Principal photography began in Connecticut on October 20, 2021, and wrapped on December 22, 2021. On Rotten Tomatoes, 45% of 67 critics' reviews were positive, with an average rating of 5.4 out of 10. The site's consensus suggested that, despite strong performances from its talented leads, Mr. Harrigan's Phone never fully connects with the intriguing themes of its source material. Metacritic, which uses a weighted average, gave the film a score of 55 out of 100 based on 15 critics, indicating mixed or average reviews. Brian Costello of Common Sense Media gave the film 4 out of 5 stars, noting that while viewers might expect a traditional horror thriller, the movie is more focused on coming of age, the dangers of revenge, and how smartphones have changed society. In The Hollywood Reporter, Frank Seck argued that, despite its intriguing premise, Mr. Harrigan's Phone lacks the essential ingredient needed to make it truly memorable: genuine scares. Bill Goodikins of the Arizona Republic gave the film 4 out of 5 stars, explaining that, as with many of Stephen King's best stories, the strongest parts are not necessarily the limited horror elements but the time spent developing the characters. Cinema Blend's Eric Eisenberg gave the film 2 out of 5 stars, criticizing it as a slow and uneven feature that attempts to combine a coming-of-age drama with supernatural horror but ultimately fails to make a strong emotional impact in either genre. Writing for The Guardian, Benjamin Lee also awarded the film 2 out of 5 stars, describing it as competently made but ultimately forgettable and little more than a pre-Halloween time waster. IGN's Ryan Leston was even more critical, arguing that the potentially terrifying story contains very little actual horror throughout its lengthy runtime. He pointed out the absence of traditional scares such as jump scares, dream sequences, monsters, gore, or anything substantial enough to justify calling it a full-fledged horror movie. As a longtime fan of Stephen King's novels, I have always appreciated how his stories can blend ordinary human experiences with unsettling supernatural elements. Some of his works have also become memorable films, including Stand By Me and The Shawshank Redemption. Redemption and The Mist, part of the Master of Horror's 2020 collection If It Bleeds, opens with a fascinating little ghost story called Mr. Harrigan's Phone. It was later adapted into a Netflix original horror film by John Lee Hancock, the director of The Rookie and The Blind Side. Hancock brings the same earnestness that defined those films to Stephen King's ghost story, but unfortunately, he feels like the wrong filmmaker for this particular project. Mr. Harrigan's Phone needed a sharper, darker edge. Instead, Hancock focuses heavily on blunt commentary about our dependence on technology, often sounding like an older relative lecturing everyone about why they should never own a smartphone. The adaptation, which Hancock also wrote, takes far too long to get moving and then seems hesitant to fully embrace its darker themes of revenge when they finally emerge. Still, strong performances from the late Donald Sutherland and Jaeden Martell keep the film from completely losing its appeal. Even so, you may find yourself wishing you had simply sent this one to voicemail. The wealthy Mr. Harrigan, played by Sutherland, hires a young boy named Craig, played by Martell, to read books to him because his eyesight is beginning to fail. Harrigan is an intensely old-fashioned man who owns neither a television nor a radio, although he occasionally enjoys listening to country western music in his car. He comes alive not only when Craig reads books such as Heart of Darkness, but also when the two discuss the ideas and themes behind what they have read. Their relationship becomes a formative friendship for Craig and a meaningful final chapter in Harrigan's life. It is clear that Harrigan has stepped on plenty of people during his climb up the corporate ladder. He encourages Craig to become more ruthless and decisive, whether that means standing up to a school bully or approaching a girl he likes. Harrigan gives Craig confidence, while Craig provides the elderly man with companionship and comfort during his later years. Harrigan also gives Craig a lottery ticket. When one of the scratch-off tickets eventually wins him thousands of dollars, Craig decides to use some of the money to introduce Harrigan to the modern world by buying him a smartphone. At first, Harrigan refuses, but Craig points out that a businessman as savvy as Harrigan could use the phone to keep track of financial markets and breaking news. Before long, Harrigan becomes surprisingly attached to the device. This gives Hancock and Sutherland an opportunity to deliver a lengthy warning about the dangers of replacing real life with the digital world. Harrigan talks about how smartphones could be used to spread fake news and misinformation, and he becomes increasingly disturbed by the technology. Unfortunately, the movie eventually turns into a heavy-handed cautionary tale. Its message about technology is so obvious that it often overwhelms the more interesting ideas found in King's original story. The film works much better when it explores questions of justice and power rather than simply warning viewers about smartphones. When Harrigan dies, Craig places the phone he bought for him inside the casket. Then, without giving too much away, strange things begin to happen. Craig starts receiving messages from Harrigan that seem capable of affecting the real world. That raises an intriguing question: what would you do if you had that kind of power? The movie should have centered much more strongly on that moral dilemma. Craig is given an impossible ability, and the real story should be about how a young man decides to use it. Harrigan himself would likely have used such power for darker and more selfish purposes, making Craig's choices even more important. The film eventually reaches that idea in its final act, but it takes far too long to get there. By the time the story finally becomes truly interesting, the slow build-up has already drained much of its momentum. Perhaps this is simply another reminder that just because a story works beautifully on the page does not mean it will automatically work as a feature film. There is a strong argument that Mr. Harrigan's Phone would have been more effective as an episode of an anthology horror series. In feature-length form, there simply isn't enough material to sustain the story without padding it with heavy-handed commentary. That said, a more ambitious filmmaker might have found a way to expand the story's themes and ideas without weighing them down with constant moralizing about technology. The world King created in Mr. Harrigan's Phone has plenty of potential. It simply needed a filmmaker willing to explore those ideas with more subtlety and imagination. The story also has an interesting connection to another Stephen King adaptation that dealt with smartphones. That film imagined humanity's consciousness being altered by a mysterious pulse transmitted through mobile devices, turning people into mindless zombies. The uneven result received poor reception from both critics and audiences, but King's 2020 collection If It Bleeds offered a very different story about technology, life, death, and the irresistible pull of smartphones. Mr. Harrigan's Phone was quickly picked up for a film adaptation. Unlike many of King's better-known horror stories, however, this one has more in common with Stand By Me. At its heart, it is primarily a coming-of-age drama with supernatural elements. The question is whether this quieter, more introspective story can deliver the ghostly chills of The Shining while also capturing the warmth of Rob Reiner's classic coming-of-age film. The story begins in 2003, when a young Craig is grieving the death of his mother. He finds some comfort when he is hired by the elderly John Harrigan to read books to him 3 times a week because Harrigan's eyesight is failing. Back in his heyday, Harrigan was a powerful businessman who built a huge fortune along with an intimidating reputation. After retiring, he moved to Maine, hoping to escape the noise and pressure of city life. The reading sessions go well, and over the years, the two develop a genuine bond. After 5 years and countless books, Craig and Harrigan have become close friends. Craig even receives gifts from the old man several times a year, although Harrigan's gifts are often nothing more than a simple scratch-off lottery ticket. Before long, Craig starts high school. There are good moments, especially with the support of his kind teacher, Miss Hart, but there are also difficult ones, particularly because of a cruel bully named Kenny Yankovic. Craig finds some happiness when his father eventually buys him an iPhone. Then one of Harrigan's scratch-off tickets changes everything when Craig wins several $1,000s. After spending some of the money on himself, he decides to use the rest to buy Harrigan a smartphone. At first, the old man is resistant to the idea, but Craig repays the wisdom Harrigan has given him over the years by teaching him how to use modern technology and stay connected to the changing world. Soon afterward, Harrigan dies. During the funeral, Craig places the phone he bought for him inside his jacket pocket as he pays his final respects. Then, several days after Harrigan is buried, Craig receives an impossible text message from his former mentor. Anyone expecting a full-on horror experience simply because the names Stephen King and Blumhouse appear on the poster should probably adjust their expectations before selecting this movie from the Netflix menu. Mr. Harrigan's phone is ultimately more interested in friendship, grief, morality, revenge, and the complicated relationship between people and technology than in delivering non-stop scares. Mr. Harrigan's Phone is a much more traditional ghost story, but the supernatural elements almost feel secondary to watching young Craig navigate his formative years. As a result, the movie adopts a deliberate, patient tone, favoring quiet tension and subtle unease instead of constantly piling on fear. The creepy events that unfold after Mr. Harrigan is buried often feel more like a side element than the central focus of the story. Considering that many recent Blumhouse releases have leaned toward the more conventional modern ghost story formula, I was surprised by how closely this adaptation follows Stephen King's original novel. However, when you consider that the film was written and directed by John Lee Hancock, who also directed The Blind Side and Saving Mr. Banks, its character-driven approach is hardly surprising. The movie also benefits from its two central performances. The late Donald Sutherland appears in one of his final films as the titular Mr. Harrigan, and he is as captivating as ever. Somehow, he even looks exactly like the kind of elderly man you might imagine stepping out of a Stephen King story. Martell, who has already become closely associated with King adaptations after playing Bill Denbrough in the It reboot, delivers a solid performance as Craig, a lonely but fundamentally good-hearted teenager. That said, the film does have him brooding a little too often beneath his wispy fringe. The cinematography is rich, the score is restrained, and the entire production seems determined to revive a gentler, more unsettling style of ghost story rather than relying on constant scares or cheap shock moments. And while that approach is admirable, Mr. Harrigan's Phone sometimes becomes so restrained that it edges dangerously close to being boring. Ironically, less attentive viewers may find themselves reaching for their own phones and doom scrolling instead of becoming invested in this quiet and modest tale. On paper, the premise is genuinely creepy. A young boy discovers that his actions involving a smartphone have somehow created a connection with the other side. Apple really could have used it as an advertising concept. Unfortunately, many of the unsettling ideas lose some of their impact once they are brought to the screen. There are some fascinating supernatural concepts at work, particularly the idea that Mr. Harrigan's spirit becomes trapped between worlds after Craig impulsively places the phone back with his body at the funeral. From beyond the grave, Harrigan appears to respond to Craig's isolated bursts of anger, taking action against people who have wronged him, including a bully and a drunk driver. Yet the film seems far more interested in exploring the drama and characters than fully developing the mechanics of its supernatural story. It even feels like it is providing free advertising for Apple at every opportunity. Perhaps the movie would work better for a more mature audience, people who find the rapid pace of modern life and the dangers of technology more intimidating than the idea of a murderous ghost. But I have a hard time imagining it connecting strongly with viewers whose attention spans have been damaged by the very devices Stephen King's story seems to criticize. In the end, the performances are strong, and the production values are appropriately atmospheric. But John Lee Hancock approaches the material in such an understated and languid way that it can become difficult to care about what is happening. The result is a film that may leave you wondering whether the story was simply more effective on the written page. Before smartphones, life was incredibly dull. We had no way to document what we had just eaten for dinner, nothing to stare at while sitting at the back of a bus, and no way to instantly know what our friends were thinking. Truly, those were dark times. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. Smartphones can be incredibly useful, but they can also become a serious distraction. They can pull our attention away from the world around us, encourage us to waste time when we should be doing something productive, and even create a false sense of self-worth when we depend on social media for approval. Phone addiction is real, and it is something society has increasingly had to confront. Stephen King had already explored the dangers of smartphone dependency in his 2006 novel Cell and its subsequent film adaptation. He returned to similar themes in his short story Mr. Harrigan's Phone, published in the collection If It Bleeds. John Lee Hancock's adaptation, which is available on Netflix, attempts to bring those themes to life. One of the movie's opening scenes introduces us to a high school cafeteria where students are separated not according to popularity or social status, but according to their phones. In one corner are the Samsung users, while the iPhone owners occupy another section. Other phone-based groups are scattered around the room, with nearly every student glued to a screen rather than having a real conversation with the people sitting beside them. Among them is Craig, played by Martell. When he begins high school without a phone, he immediately feels as though he is missing out. Later, his widowed father gives him an iPhone as a gift, and Craig soon starts wishing he had never received it. The reason has nothing to do with ordinary phone addiction or online bullying. Instead, it is because an elderly man Craig befriended years earlier and who had kindly given Craig his first phone begins sending him messages. At first, the texts seem harmless, but there is one major problem. Mr. Harrigan, played by Sutherland, is dead. Craig soon realizes that the deceased man is somehow communicating with him from beyond the grave. Even more disturbing, whatever Mr. Harrigan has become seems capable of taking revenge on people who have hurt Craig. Exactly how Harrigan manages to do this is something the movie never fully explores. That may disappoint viewers expecting a traditional, fully developed ghost story. Hancock instead creates something much more abstract, placing greater emphasis on Craig's relationship with Harrigan and the grief that follows his death than on straightforward horror. As a result, this is not a movie filled with bloody scenes of supernatural revenge or constant jump scares designed to make you drop your phone in fright. Although it embraces supernatural elements, the film is ultimately more interested in exploring loneliness, friendship, grief, and the darker side of our dependence on technology. It doesn't matter too much that the film isn't particularly scary, because at its heart, this is more of a character-driven story about a troubled teenager and his unlikely friendship with the elderly billionaire at the center of the title. Still, for a movie built around the idea that Mr. Harrigan can make terrible things happen from 6 feet underground, it could have delivered a much stronger horror experience. Horror fans may be disappointed unless they go in with lowered expectations. Compared with many other Stephen King adaptations, this one is considerably less gruesome and relies more on drama, character development, and supernatural mystery. Jaeden Martell, already familiar to Stephen King fans from It Chapter 1, is convincing as Craig, a sensitive young boy whose life takes an unexpected turn after the death of his elderly friend. Sutherland is equally effective as the grumpy, mysterious old man whose dark past is only hinted at rather than fully explored. The two actors share a believable chemistry, creating an unlikely friendship after Mr. Harrigan hires Craig to read books aloud to him. Their performances help cover some of the script's weaknesses, including occasional plot holes and a lack of a satisfying resolution. The movie sits somewhere between the coming-of-age nostalgia of Stand By Me and the supernatural horror found in many other Stephen King adaptations. Unfortunately, Mr. Harrigan's Phone is too restrained on both fronts to leave a particularly memorable impression. Even so, John Lee Hancock's adaptation of King's novel from the 2020 collection If It Bleeds handles the relatively thin source material well enough to become an entertaining supernatural drama. It premiered on Netflix on October 5, providing Halloween season with a moderately creepy story. Craig, played as a child by Colin O'Brien, loses his mother to cancer in 2003, leaving him and his grieving father, Matt, struggling in their small town. Things change when Craig's scripture reading at church catches the attention of Mr. Harrigan, played by Sutherland, a billionaire financial tycoon who has retired to the quiet community to spend his final years away from the public eye. Because Mr. Harrigan's eyesight is deteriorating, he offers Craig a regular after-school job reading classic literature aloud. Their reading begins, somewhat unexpectedly, with Lady Chatterley's Lover, before moving on to Dickens, Conrad, and other literary works. The arrangement works surprisingly well for both of them. Although Mr. Harrigan is reserved and old-fashioned, the two gradually become close friends. The older man has a habit of giving Craig lottery tickets with holiday cards, and when Craig eventually wins $3,000, he decides to thank his benefactor by giving him an iPhone, similar to the one Craig recently purchased for himself. Mr. Harrigan initially declines the gift, but changes his mind after realizing that the phone could allow him to receive stock market information much faster than waiting for the previous day's Wall Street Journal to arrive. Not long afterward, Mr. Harrigan dies of natural causes. As a sentimental gesture honoring their friendship, Craig secretly places the phone inside his friend's open casket during the funeral. Up to this point, the story contains very little supernatural material. Hancock attempts to gradually introduce a darker atmosphere through gothic visuals, unsettling imagery, and ominous music from composer Jaeden. Sutherland is also directed to play Mr. Harrigan as more intimidating and mysterious than he is portrayed in the original story. A montage of newspaper clippings hints that the billionaire may have been a dangerous or even ruthless man when crossed during his business career. Even so, Mr. Harrigan never becomes much of a genuinely frightening presence. As Craig begins treating his deceased mentor as a kind of voicemail confidant, he occasionally receives mysterious responses on his own phone. His father dismisses the messages as a prank, suggesting that someone may have hacked the old man's phone. But things become much darker when Craig is bullied by a classmate, Cyrus Arnold, and a beloved teacher later suffers a terrible fate. Angry and desperate, Craig calls upon his late friend for help and lethal justice is mysteriously delivered. The concept feels somewhat stretched even in King's original 90-page novel, which plays more like an extended anecdote than a fully developed horror story. The adaptation is also weakened by a narrator's voice that sometimes sounds more like that of a baby boomer author than a modern teenager, particularly in its repeated focus on the dangers and fascination of new technology. There is even a section that feels almost like an Apple commercial, celebrating how younger people introduce older generations to the internet and smartphones. Hancock manages to soften these elements with some finesse, but he remains faithful enough to the source material to preserve its central ideas. Ultimately, Mr. Harrigan's phone works better as a quiet coming-of-age drama with supernatural elements than as a traditional horror movie. Its strongest qualities are the performances, especially the relationship between Craig and Mr. Harrigan, while its biggest weakness is that the supernatural premise never becomes as frightening or impactful as it could have been. The film never really builds a much suspense or mystery. Sutherland does not reappear as a senior variation on his goal at the end of Philippa Kaufman's Great Invasion of the Body Snatchers version 44 years ago. However, or whatever his character is capable of, far from the grave remains a murky and no too especially interesting given that the victims are certifiable bad guys who deserve it. Their fates mostly kept to off-screen, nor is Craig's remorse after each demise very compelling, no more so than his pleasant if blandly sketchy relationships with dad, a first-girlfriend Thorough, or a supportive high school instructor Kirby Howell-Baptiste. The results balancing over a familiar warm and fuzzy growing up gay and half-hearted horror revenge evaporate quickly from the mind, throws a little cumulative force that might linger, yet at the same time Hancock does an admirable job keeping the sour and a 3/4s polished and engaging, maintaining a consistent viewer interest even if the ultimate rewarder underwhelms us in any NFL. Flamboyant turns to his well-cast actors, length era characters like naturalism, including our primarily sedentary Sutherland and Thatcher hulking bully, while the presentation is so handsome in a straightforward non-flashy way. If at first glance Mr. Harrigan Man's exterior strikes a retro sinister older dark house note, production designer Michael Canby's interior is nonetheless impressed with the old guy's excellent taste. DP John Schwartzman's imagery makes good use of attractive locations, although it appears upstate New York and Connecticut are standing in for Maine, here best known for liberally dramatized inspirational biopics The Bright Side of the Rocky, Saving Mr. Bent. Thanks writer-director Hancock demonstrates no particular feel for thriller mechanics, although Mr. Harrigan's phone still works better within the general framework than his ponderous serial killer policia procedural The Little Things from last year. This latest may not rank among the best screen Stephen King Adaptations beauty God knows it's now, near the worst of the mostly quiet adaptation of Stephen King novel Mr. Heron's Phone ISO underscored by a distracting and a familiar sound. It's that post-it scrippy of the large barrel of stories has written studios searching for third and fourth tier books to be dragged to the screen, an ungainly process that only serves to highlight the author's weakest spots. Recently we've shrugged our way through Pablo Larraín's visually arresting yet otherwise uninteresting Apple series The Story, the dull Adriana Brody-led Chapel-Wait-based Tona Jerusalem's Lotte Damp remake of Firestarter, a story that was never that too interesting to begin with, and now our thinly plotted 888-page short story becomes a bloated 106-minute Netflix movie, a competently made yet utterly inconsequential pre-Halloween time waster. It's stuck in that awkward place here between two well-trodden king subgenres, a small-town coming-of-age and small-town a supernatural, never quite connecting as either too silly to be an involving a drama and a subdued to be a creepy horror, in a hope to sway some of the millions who made it. Chapter 1 the most commercially successful King adaptation of all time. It made a still rather staggering $700 million worldwide. Star Jaeden Martell is recruited as Hedda Kid again, this time playing Craig Atina, living with his father in a small town in Maine. He's taking us back via voiceover over through his relationship with local millionaire Mr. Harrigan Donald Sutherland, who hired him as a kid to read out loud as his sight disintegrated. Over the years the pair become closer, and when Craig gets some money of his own he treats Mr. Harrigan to his first iPhone. When Harrigan enters, his addiction to his new phone extends beyond the grave, with Craig still receiving calls and cryptic texts when people start dying. Craig begins to question who he was friends with. It's a kind of befuddling why something so aggressively pedestrian as this would attract the attention of horror hater makers Blumhouse. Ryan Murphy as AP, producer, and The Blind Side and Thea founders John Lee Hancock as writer-director. The mystery of what would lure them in proving far more haunting than anything the film comes up with. The stretching a relatively short novel to our full-length feature is too often a fool's errand, and Mr. Harrigan's Phone bears the hallmarks of the very worst, most pointless examples: a lumbering pace, poorly developed characters, and absence of plot dialogue that feels as if it's been slowed down just to pad it all out, and so anything that might initially intrigue ends up frustrating instead. Perhaps if Hancock had picked a tone and stuck with it, things might have felt a little smoother, but he's never able to figure out what he wants us to feel. As a horror thriller it's woefully ineffective and curiously under-explained, and as a drama about adolescence it's too thinly etched for use to care, and between the languid back and forth between the two genres Hancock tries to stuff in some puddle deeper commentary about our overrelia, its own technology, which is about as complex as someone looking around at everyone on their phones and shaking their head in dismay. Phones bad, books good, okay, and for someone as Twitter literate as King it all seems a little tired. It's solidly acted by Martell and Sutherland, although the latter seems as desperate as we are to let loose and have a bit more fun, and has a confident sense of fireplace as King adaptations often do. Due to it's all rather unforgivably done, a call to be swiftly ignored. More details of Mr. Heron's Phone film. While Stephen King is often remembered as the king of scares, the master's horror books are anchored in deeply emotional human relationships, from classics like Carrier to new successes like Outsider. King's most beloved stories chill us to the bones because they deal with real trauma, social exclusion, and loneliness. The nightmarish images King evokes wouldn't hit us so hard if there were not manifestations of real demons that hunt us all every day. With Mr. Harrigan's Phone, King puts horror on the back burner to tell a coming-of-age story about morality and friendship. There are still supernatural elements sprinkled all over Mr. Harrigan's Phone. Beauty, the novel is more concerned with the interior universe of its protagonist Craig than with ghost stories. The very nature of Mr. Harrigan's Phone imposes some serious challenges for a movie adaptation. While Mr. Harrigan's Phone is a memorably story that forces us to confront the ugly things we sometimes wish for other people, the novel is a slow burner with no significant payoff. As such, Mr. Heron's Phone is not exactly cinematic, as specifically for viewers looking for a new spooky experience. While there's enough dread in Craig's story, Mr. Harrigan's Phone still leans more heavily into drama than a horror, and it's precisely in this somewhat uncomfortable position that Nandler's adaptation of the novel stands. That's because Netflix's movie is our faithful adaptation of the original. worker with all its limitations, and while writer and director John Lee Hancock is an experienced filmmaker, we can't help but to feel that some of the magic got lost in other translation from written text to film. Netflix's Mr. Harrigan's phone stars Jaeden Martell as Craig, a kid who gets hired by the reclusive billionaire Harrigan Donald Sutherland to read books out loud to him 3 times per week. In his old age, Mr. Harrigan cannot trust his eyes for reading anymore, which leads him to employ Craig under his service. Martell, already a horror expert after retire and the lodge, knows how to bring our teenager to life with all the confusion and ambition that surround us all at an early age. As for Sutherland, his version of Mr. Harrigan is the perfect portrait of a cutthroat capitalist, a man who doesn't hesitate even for a second to destroy other people if that gets him what he wants. For almost 1 hour, Mr. Harrigan's phone explores the bond between these 2 characters and how an unlikely friendship is born from their fateful meeting. Mr. Harrigan's phone is at its peak, and it lets its cast flex their dramatic muscles to create a touching story of found family. Besides the tonsure, the titular phone is introduced and Craig begins to teach Mr. Harrigan about the wonder of the modern world. The movie is also highly successful in unraveling the complex relationships we forge with the technology. While smartphones are wondrous tools of communication that literally put the world in the palm of our hands, they also tend to absorb our attention and alienate us from the outside world. Moreover, smartphones are symbols of status capable of recreating the rules of social interaction, especially for teenagers entering high school. Finally, as a somewhat period piece set in the early 2000s, Mr. Harrigan's phone is also a curious study of a time not so long ago when smartphones were not yet essential everyday tools. While it's fascinating to watch Mr. Harrigan's phone as a drama about generation differences, things get a little messier when the supernatural outlines of King's story start to show up in the movie. As promised by every marketing piece from Harrigan phone, Mr. Harrigan will die at some point, and Craig will keep somewhat connected with his old friends going through their smartphones. However, this connection doesn't take the spotlight, as Mr. Harrigan's phone remains a coming-of-age story of when spirits cross into the living world, and that's when the by-the-books approach of Netflix's adaptation fails to capture the tension of King's novel. When Craig first suspects Mr. Harrigan might still be around, the supernatural elements are underplayed as a series of coincidences. It takes a tragedy for Craig to reach out to his old friend with dire consequences for the living, and nonetheless, Mr. Harrigan's phone is originally a meditation on growing up with the weight of death hanging over your head, and about how dark thoughts could have horrible repercussions if we ever had the power to make them our reality. But these reflections just work better in a book than in a movie, because why based on internal turmoil does not translate so well into images. So once Mr. Harrigan gets out of the picture and Craig loses his partner, keeping the story going without hiccups is challenging even for an actor such as Martell. That's aggravated by how the supernatural promise gets in the way of the audience enjoying the coming of age story, especially because Mr. Harrigan's phone will never become as scary as our horror fiends hope. Despite its flaws, Harrigan's phone remains a careful adaptation of one of King's most touching stories to date, and while there are not many frights in this horror movie, it remains a solid entry of Netflix's enviable collection of King's adaptations. Even if a less faithful adaptation could make the story fit best of the film format, Mr. Harrigan's phone is still worth a watch for those willing to ponder mortality, morality, and how there's no absolute good or evil. When I first heard about Mr. Harrigan's phone, I was intrigued. I want you to read the same synopsis that I did before. I start when Craig, a young boy living in a smaller town, Jaeden Martell, befriends Mr. Harrigan, an older reclusive billionaire Donald Sutherland. The two begin to form an unlikely bond over their love of books and reading, but when Mr. Harrigan sadly passes away, Craig discovers that no to everything is dead and gone, and strangely finds himself able to communicate with his friend from the grave through the iPhone. And there's a supernatural coming-of-age story that shows that certain connections are never lost. Now the first thing you think of is that this is going to be a supernatural type film, something similar to classic 2000 film Frequency. The problem is that it is not in any way remotely is the last linear of that synopsis true. I think the film has been slightly missold. I understand it is based on an 88-page novel by Stephen King, which I have not read. My issue is not so much with the film itself. He actually found the film to be very watchable and enjoyed it. My issues is that it is not really what it are advertised as the film is more of our coming-of-age story for the Craig, the character that is played by Jaeden Martell. There is no real horror element, there is no real supernatural element of the communication with the dead. Harrigan is more of a therapeutic complaining by Craig and a couple of far nonsensical text messages, and then some mere coincidental deaths that Craig either asks for or were karma if this happened in real life and was examined from a critical standpoint. Everything could be explained. In the end, the film tries to hit on a few points about technology, living on your phone, the consequences of revenge and so on, but when you hear a Stephen King you kind of want more, and yeah, I think if this film would have taken a few liberties with the short 88-page novel it is based on and instead went full on in one direction or another, it would have been much better either as a horror film or as a supernatural, and instead it is just a nice drama. Few information about this film and eerie meditation or no, a relationship with the technology. Leave it to Stephen King to craft an interesting unconventional narrative tackling death head on. Thought it may be rated PG-13. Mr. Harrigan's phonia has some bite by way of its creepier staying power and over the viewer. Super producers Jason Blum and Ryan Murphy work with writer director John Lee Hancock, the founder. The Blind's idea to focus on coming-of-age drama and life's big questions over goopier extravagant horror narration from our lead Craig Jaeden Martell. Stephen King's The Lodge constantly keeps us in his headspace. A dash of the supernatural brings King's short story to life amidst the stylish haunting shades of realism. We first meet these characters in 2003, a Harlow, Maine, wherein a young Craig Colin O'Brien connects with elderly Mr. Harrigan Donald Sutherland. The Hunger Games are swimming with sharks after the boy catches his eye during church service. Here, the richest man in Maine and an apparent billionaire. Harrigan's eyesight is beginning to fail him. He hires little Craig for $5 an hour to read books to him at his mansion inside the home. Style is old and elegant, but nevertheless connecting with Harrigan is a highlighter of the week for Craig. Each time he sits in Harrigan's study, both Craig and his father Joe Tippett, mayor of Eastertown, are still recovering from his mother's death. Harrigan seems to give the boy a newfound sense of purpose. The film flashes forward 5 years and Craig, now played by Martell, is more entwined in the world of Mr. Harrigan than ever. Each time they sit together 3 times a week to be precise, we are given the title of whatever book they are reading from Lardy Chatterley's Love It Beyond the Sun and Beyond. Harrigan gifts Craig with numerous lottery tickets on special occasions, yet none of them appear to be winners. As Craig starts his first day of high school, he immediately realizes that without owning a cell phone he exists on the fringes of new societal norms. He begs his father for a phone to help him fit in at school. An annoying bully simply refuses to leave Craig alone. When a Christmas rolls around, Harrigan's gift winds up being a lottery ticket that earns Craig a cool $4. While his dad finally gifts Craig with a brand new iPhone. Of course, having a phone for the first time opens up a whole new can of worms that Craig's teenage brain may barely be able to comprehend. While many people take advantage of the opportunities that having a cellular device at his fingertips provide, rarely do we actually take a moment to appreciate the many conveniences and necessities that phones help us with in the modern age. King explores not only what this means for Craig but also how Harrigan reacts to this noteworthy shift. Using part of his lottery winnings, Craig buys Harrigan our phone too. Initially resistant, Harrigan embraces the idea. The more Craig makes it seem appealing with the world at one's fingertips. What could be better? Their meetings suddenly evolve a bit. Now each time Craig comes to read a book, he also introduces Harrigan to new features on his phone. When Harrigan has a breakdown about what this could mean for spreading false information and fake news, he basically predicts where the technology has taken us to in this era of instant reactions and quick cancellations. The crux of the tale does not unfold until the moment Craig walks into a mostly empty mansion and discovers Harrigan's dead body clinging tightly to his phone. My heart broke for Craig as he must experience the second major loss in his young life. In the throes of his grieving, Craig texts Harrigan one final time saying that he will miss their conversations as tears slide down his Harrigan's cheeks. Craig leaves a Harrigan's cell phone in the pocket of his jacket at the viewing of the body, delivering it to its final resting place here after the funeral. Craig is told that he will be hearing from lawyers in a couple of weeks and is given a final letter to him from Harrigan. A chill went down my spine here as Craig reads Harrigan's final words, which include that Harrigan will miss the era conversations. Too bizarre indeed, considering that Craig only texted Harrigan this after he had passed on sooner enough. Cryptic texts come through from Harrigan's handle Pirate King, tying a technology into the film along with our dash of supernatural horror. John Lee Hancock was certainly not the first choice of director I would have envisioned for this project. However, Hancock does an exceptional job of sprucing up what already existed on the page. Craig and Harrigan's friendship may seem a bit weird, but the kindly rich grandfather vibe present in King's text is pushed to newer heights in cinematic form. Sutherland and Martell play off one another well as how they chew through contemplative layered dialogue as Craig approaches big high school moments like a first dance, a college applicant, and eventually college. The mysteries surrounding Mr. Harrigan's otherworldly connection loom large, through coming for only the horror element. I leave a bit disappointed, mainly because Mr. Harrigan's phone never manages to go a full tilt stereotypical scary. However, I personally became very invested in Craig thanks to Jaeden Martell's immersive charismatic performance and Keonji's potent commentary. Our phones are what tie us into the world of today, so what happens when they follow us to our afterlife? The concept personally chilled me to the bone and made me reflect on my own relationship with cell phones. The next time anyone close to me dies, the error number is respectfully getting blocked. Mr. Harrigan's phone rings for audiences around the world to answer when it debuts exclusively to Netflix on Wednesday, October 5th. At the time of our writing, we are now in October, which means that for a lot of people it's time here to focus on horror and Halloween. Streamers such as Netflix have to cater to that crowd, and one of the ways that they are doing that this year is by releasing yet another Stephen King adaptation. Netflix has actually been a pretty decent home for these adaptations, as it has previously released such King adaptations as In the Tall Grass in 1922 and Gerald's Game, with the last near being easily the best of the Netflix King films. Like In the Tall in 1922, Mr. Harrigan's PH1 is based on an era of King's novels, and like those other two films, while there are things I really like about the film, I think there are a couple of things about it that make it difficult to recommend to general horror fans. Mr. Harrigan's phone follows a young man named Craig, played by Jaeden Martell, who befriends a sterner elderly man, Mr. Harrigan, played by Donald Sutherland, and works for him by reading books aloud to him. As their friendship grows, Craig teaches Harrigan how to use our smartphone. Not long thereafter, Craig finds Mr. Harrigan dead. Deeply saddened, Craig decides to leave Mr. Harrigan's phone in Mr. Harrigan's casket so he can still text and call him to talk to him. During one of these calls, Craig talks about his bully. When the bully is later found dead, Craig starts to suspect that Mr. Harrigan is now an avenging spirit. A couple of years ago, the Saving Mr. Banks and the Blindside filmmaker John Lee Hancock took to Netflix to released the Highwayman Hazel and focused telling O Father, Bonnie and Clyde legend, and it was our case where the premise and the cast were better than the overall execution. It pains me to say that even though I did enjoy watching Mr. Harrigan's phone, I have similar problems with the execution of Hancock's latest film, though not quite a dud. The payoff in Ray Rogan phone is non-existent. For that reason, I can't in a good faith really recommend this film, even though I actually did enjoy parts of it and thought the ending was a fairly natural end point for the story. The thing is, though, Hancock fails to really deliver on the horror aspect so far. The story, it feels bland because it doesn't really take the story in exciting directions. I really feel like here it was a missed opportunity to not go a full Death Note or at least Final Destination, except at one point in the film. However, the thing is that the film rigs on that character's turner immediately, which kind of just kneecaps the film. The acting isn't the problem. I think Jaeden Martell and Donald Sutherland are both really strong here, as their conversations are the best thing about the entire film. But on the other hand, Mr. Harrigan's monologue about the dangers of a smartphone felt to be too didactic or on the nose. It is a pretty great Stephen King premise, but in failing to add anything meaningful to it or in failing to add some bold horror developments to it, I think writer-director John Lee Hancock fails the story. There should have been more to it after Harrigan's demise. However, I think it kind of works as this coming-of-age story, with a slight supernatural potential but sincere. It doesn't really have a payoff. It's a tough to recommend. Cast direct by John Lee Hancock, written by John Lee Hancock, produced by Ryan Murphy, Jason Blum, Carla Hacken, starring Donald Sutherland, Jaeden, Martell, Joe Tippett, cinematography John Schwarzman, edited by Roberta Faison, music by J.V. Navaresia, production companies Blumhouse Television, Ryan Murphy Productions, distributed by Netflix. A release date October 5, 2022. Running time 106 minutes. Country United States language English. Harrigan's Phone is a 2022 Americana supernatural coming-of-age horror film. A film written and directed by John Lee Hancock. It is based on the novel of the same name by Stephen King from the collection If It Bleeds. The film stars Donald Sutherland, Jaeden, Martell, Joe Tippett, and Kirby Howell-Baptiste. It follows Craig, who has a stronger friendship with retired businessman John Harrigan. Both get their first iPhones after the former wins a lottery. Despite the latter's a supernatural connection persists between them through their phones, one of which is breed alongside Harrigan. Mr. Harrigan's Phone was released on October 5, 2022 by Netflix. The film received mixed reviews from critics. In 2003, young Craig becomes acquainted with retired businessman John Harrigan following the death of his mother Joanna, with the instructions to simply read to him 3 times a week. 5 years later, a teenager Craig and elderly Harrigan have become near friends. During this time, Craig starts a high school and becomes close to to a teacher who comes to his aid when Kenny Yankovic, a school bully, attempts to intimidate him after winning $3,000 from a lottery ticket that Harrigan gave him and receiving his first iPhone for a Christmas. Craig buys one for Harrigan too. Despite initial resistance to new technology, he enjoys the phone. The elderly Harrigan dies, leaving Craig heartbroken at the loss of his friend. At the funeral, Craig sneaks Harrigan's phone into the coffin, later being informed by Harrigan's associate that he was left a bequest in Harrigan's will. Craig will receive $800 in a trust fund to support his future studies and pursue of a writing career, which she had told Harrigan about. Craig calls Harrigan's phone as a gesture of thanks. The next morning, he discovers that Harrigan sent him an odd text message, though his father chalks it up to being a bug within the iPhone itself. Life goes on for Craig. Goes to a dance with his crush, only to be attacked by Kenny, who accuses him of ratting out his drug-dealing activities on school grounds, getting him expelled. Later that night, Craig calls her answer phone in a fit of frustration and sadness. He tells him what Kenny did, and he is afraid that this won't end, and I wish that you were here just to give me some advice. Kenny is found dead the next day, having apparently fallen from his bedroom window while attempting to sneak out. Scared by what happened, Craig goes to an Apple store, upgrades his phone to a newer model, and puts away his old one. Craig graduates from high school and departs for college in Boston to study journalism. While there, his father calls her to tell him Miss Hart was killed in a car accident involving a drunk driver, leaving her fiancé hospitalized. The driver, Dean Whitmore, is sent to rehab instead of prison for the accident. Although he'd been caught for drunk driving on other occasions, his license was suspended and he had an OP in a container. Infuriated by the verdict, Craig returns to his room and uses his old phone to call Harrigan, explicitly wishing death on Whitmore. Craig later learns Whitmore was found dead in his shower. He drives to the rehab center and bribes a worker there to give him details about the suicide. He is told that Whitmore swallowed shampoo and a piece of broken soap bar. Craig is disturbed to learn that the soap is the same brand used by Miss Hart, and Whitmore's suicide note is actually a lyric from the song Stand By Your Man by Tammy Wynette, Harrigan's ringtone. Craig breaks down and returns to his hometown. While there, he remembers opening her aunt's secret closet, which he had refused to let Craig enter after he passed that it was actually a shrine to his deceased mother. He visits his gravestone, apologizing for his messages. He theorizes that Harrigan odd text messages to him are his way of begging Craig to let his spirit rest in peace and for him to move forward in the here and now. As he leaves Harrigan's grave, Craig visits his own mother's and collapses in tears, begging for forgiveness. He then rushes to the Tona quarry, contemplating the water while he's standing very near the edge before throwing his old phone into the water, but finds himself unable to do the same with his new phone. As Craig walks away, he quietly narrates that when he himself passes on and is buried, he wants his pockets to be empty. In July 2028, Netflix acquired the film rights to Harrigan's Phone to be produced by Blumhouse Productions and Ryan Murphy, with John Lee Hancock set to write and direct the film in October 2021. Donald Sutherland, Jaeden, Martell, Kirby, Howell-Baptiste, and Joe Tippett joined the cast. Principal photographer started in Connecticut on October 20, 2021 and wrapped on December 22, 2021. On the review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, 45% of 67 critics reviews area positive, with an average rating of 5.4 ASL10. The website's consensus reads that despite a pair of laid performances from its talented leads, Mr. Harrigan's phone never quite connects with the source material's intriguing theme. As a Metacritic, which uses a weighted average, assign the film a score of 55 out of 100 based on 15 critics indicating mixed or average reviews. In Common Sense Media, Brian Costello gave it a rating of 4 out of 5, saying that viewers might expect a horror thriller, but this is more of a coming-of-age story about the perils of revenge and a reflection on how we've changed since the arrival of the smartphone. In The Hollywood Reporter, Frank Schick said that unfortunately, despite its intriguing premise, Harrigan's Phone lacks the necessary ingredient to make it truly memorable. It simply isn't very scary. In the Arizona Republic, Bill Goody, CEO, gave it 4 out of 5, saying that as with the greatest King stories, the best parts here are no to the horror elements, of which there are few. It's the time spent with the characters on cinema blend. Erica Eisenberg gave it 2 out of 5 stars, saying that it's a dull and lagging feature that tries to be both a coming-of-age drama and a supernatural horror film, and it ends up failing to make an emotional impact with either genre. Writing in The Guardian, Benjamin Lear also gave the film 2 out of 5 stars, calling it a competently made yet utterly inconsequential pre-Halloween time waster. On IGN, Ryan said, "What's worse is that this potentially a terrifying tale does almost nothing of any horror value throughout its overly longer runtime. There are no jump scares, no dream sequences, no monsters, no corpse or anything remotely resembling a hefty enough scare to warrant calling this a horror film." Review of Mr. Harrigan's Phone film. I've long been a fan of Stephen King's novels, and some of them have been turned into great films in the past, including Stand By Me, The Shawshank Redemption, and The Mist. The Master of Horror's 20,120 collection, If It Bleeds, opened with a wonderful little ghost story called Mr. Harrigan's Phone, which is now a Netflix original horror film from John Lee Hancock, the director of The Rookie and The Blind Side. Here brings the earnestness of those films to King's ghost story and proves to be the wrong filmmaker for this project. Harrigan's Phone needed a viciousness that Hancock has to in favor of blunter commentary about dependence on technology that sounds about as in touch as that old relative of yours who will lecture you about why he's never going to get a smartphone. Hancock's adaptation, which he also wrote, takes forever to get going and then seems almost afraid of its own dark themes of vengeance when it finally gets to them. An early engaging performance from the great Donald Sutherland and a consistently rounded one from Jaeden Martell keep Mr. Harrigan's Phone from completely going dead. Beauty, you're going to want to send this one to voicemail. The wealthy Mr. Harrigan Sutherland hires a young man named Craig Martell to read to him because the old man's eyes are good going in his later years. He's a deeply analog man who doesn't own a TV or even a radio, even if he likes listening to his country or western tunes in the car. Sometimes he comes to life, not just when Craig reads a material like Heart of Darkness, but when they discuss the themes after. It's our formative friendship for Craig and our lovely final chapter for Mr. Harrigan, who clearly has stepped on a few people now his climb up the corporate ladder. He encourages Craig to be ruthless and decisive here, whether it's in standing up to a high school bully or approaching a girl he likes. He gives Craig confidence and Craig gives him some late in life comfort, and Mr. Harrigan gives him a lottery ticket too when Craig gets a $3 From his scratch-off gift Thea decides to take some of that money to introduce the old man to the eye-world. At first Mr. Harrigan refuses until Thea Kid points out how much the business-savvy Harrigan can stay on top of the market and breaking financial news. It's not long before Harrigan himself is hooked on his phone, allowing Hancock and Sutherland a truly ear-rolling speech about the danger of giving up reality for the life of our smartphone, as Harrigan goes on about how these devices will be used for fake news and misinformation. He's frightened by the schismo. The film devolves into a heavy-handed cautionary tale with blunter messaging that the source material didn't need in its original form. Mr. Harrigan's phone works better as our conversation starter about justice and power than anything literal. You see when the old man kicks the bucket, Craig puts his new phone in the casket with him, and well, things start to happen without spoiling. Craig leaves messages for Harrigan that seem to impact the real world. What would you do with that kind of power? The film version of Mr. Harrigan's phone needs to be a morality tale for its protagonist and viewer, a questioning of how far we're willing to go to right the wrongs of the world. If Mr. Harrigan himself had the power that Craig ends up having, he would have used it in malevolent ways, and so this really should be a story of a young man facing a moral quandary about what to do with an impossible power. It becomes that barely in the final act, but it's such a dull slog to get there. Perhaps this is just another reminder that just because something works on the page doesn't mean it will work in a film. Yes, there is our sense that this would have been stronger as an episode of an anthology horror show instead of a feature. There's not quite enough meat on its bones in thesis form, and it's tempting to blame that on the fact that it's based on a Nolan, and yet it also feels like a more ambitious filmmaker could have found that to expanding on its themes and concept instead of just weighing them down with the moral posturing about tech. Someone else could have expanded the world of Theanola without such a straight face. Here there's a lot of potential in the ideas that King plays within Mr. Harrigan's phone. If only they had been given to our filmmaker willing to answer the call. The last time a Stephen King adaptation dabbled so blatantly with the notion of the smartphone, we got a movie about mankind having their consciousness rewritten by a pulse through era devices that turned them into mindless zombies. However, the horribly uneven finished project only succeeded getting a bad reception, get it from critics and fans alike. However, in 2020, King's latest collection of short stories, Let It Bleed, contained an altogether different tale concerning life, death, and the all-consuming lure of the smartphone in the form of Mr. Harrigan's phone, and it certainly didn't take long before someone snapped it up for a film version. However, while King is most famous for high-s stories that tread a more familiar horror-based path, this story has more in common with the likes of Stand By Me, as it primarily concerns itself with the coming-of-age drama. While it spins its supernatural story, can this quiet, more introspective story bring the ghostly chills of the likes of The Shining, while including the warmth of Rob Reiner's 8's classic. In 2003, younger child Craig is in mourning for his dead mother, but he finds a respite from the sadness when he's hired by the elderly John Harrigan to read books to him 3 times a week, as his eyesight has started to fail. Harrigan, back in his heyday, was something of a formidable businessman and amassed both a sizable fortune and a fearsome reputation before he eventually retired and moved to Maine in order to obtain the seclusion from city life he so desired. Their reading sessions go well, although I personally wouldn't be comfortable with my preteen son reading a Lady Chatterley's Lover to an old man. And after 5 years and many books later, the two have built up quite a bond, and Craig even gets presents 4 times a year from the old man, even if the millionaire only gifts him a single mere scratch card for each occasion. And before you know, Craig is soon starting high school. However, while this UPS has supported by kindly teacher Miss Harter and Downs, he's preyed upon by Sister bully Kenny Yankovich. It's all madly worth it when his father resents and buys him an iPhone. However, one day one of those scratch cards Harrigan gifts him pays out to the sum of $3. But after he's used the money for what he wants, he uses the rest to buy a phone for Mr. Harrigan. And while the old Jesuit is initially resistant, Craig repays the wisdom that his elderly friend has given him by teaching him how to connect with the modern technology. However, soon Harrigan passes and in his grief Craig places the phone he bought him into his jacket pocket at the funeral when paying his respects. But one night, days after Harrigan is put in the ground, Craig gets an impossible text message from his mentor or anyone expecting a more full-on injection of horror after seeing both a Stephen King and Blumhouse named on their poster might well be served by checking their expectations at the door before they select this movie off from the Netflix menu page. You see, Mr. Harrigan's phone is something more of a traditional ghost story that almost runs a second to us watching young Craig go through his formative years. As a result, the movie has been granted a more deliberate tone that favors a more and a subtle approach to things rather than a piling on the dread, as the creepier happenings that occur after Harrigan has to be put in the ground are more than an afterthought than the main thrust of the tale. Thanks to Blumhouse's more recent releases have favored the more typical feel for a modern ghost story. I was surprised to see how close the movie stuck to King's original novel, but we know you consider that the movie was written and directed by John Lee Hancock, who also owes us The Blind Side and Saving Mr. Banks. The more character-based approach into that, pursuing it all, it also helps that the main two-hander of Harrigan and Craig are portrayed by capable actors, with the late Donald Sutherland appearing in one of his final movies in the titular role Mr. Harrington. That eyes are not his phone. Sutherland is beguiling as he ever was, while somehow managing to look like I've imagined every old man in any Stephen King book to look like Wizzy Jaeden Martell, who seems to be hoovering up Stephen King roles. Of playing Bill Denbrough in the reboot does a good job as the soon but ultimately good-hearted Craig, even though the movie has him brooding mournfully through his wispy fringe a bit too much. The cinematography is rich, the score subtle, and the movie seemingly attempts to try and resurrect the more gentle, unsettling kind of ghost story, rather going for full-on scares or cheap shocks. All this is all very well and good, but Mr. Harrigan's phone plays things so subtle that it often teeters on the boring side, and A&R will no doubt give less attentive viewers reaching for their phone to doom scroll rather than fully invest in this quietly modest tale. The thing is, the story is fairly creepy on paper, as this young boy realizes his actions with the phone has somehow got him a connection with the other side. Apple really should include that in their ads, but all this seems to disperse in a puff of dust when put on a film. There's some truly unsettling concepts at work here, especially we on the UK side, that her iron spirit has been trapped and transitioned to the other side by Craig's spontaneous act of returning Harrigan's phone with his bodger at the funeral, and enacts Craig's isolated bursts of anger against a bullier and a drunk driver at random points. Beauty, the film seems far more interested in probing the drama and providing free advertising for Apple at every given turn. Maybe this film would play far better to the type of mature audience who find a breakneck pace and the prospect of dealing with modern technology far more intimidating than the prospect of a murderous ghost. But I can't see this film landing particularly well with anyone whose attention span has been stripped from them like Lucy Paint, thanks to the very gadgets King seems to both build up and vilify in the end. While the performances are stronger and the production values are suitably autumnal, Hancock approaches the material in such an understated and languid way it's tough to care about anything that's going on, and not only does it leave you thoroughly grippy, it eventually leads you to believe it probably was far more successful on the written page. Before we had smartphones, life was incredibly dull. We had no way to document what we had just had for dinner. We had nothing to look at when sitting at the back of a bus, and we had no way to understand our friends' most innermost thoughts. These were darker times. Indeed, I'm being sarcastic. Far course, while smartphones can be a useful addition to our lives, they can also be a menace. They can distract us from the beauty of the world around us, cause you to waste time when we should be doing something more productive, and they can't give us a false sense of self-worth. We know we rely on social media for approval. A phone addiction is a real thing, and it's something we need to face up to. Author Stephen King already warned us about the dangers of smartphone dependency in his 2006 novel Cell and the subsequent movie and in his short story Mr. Harrigan's Phone, which was published in the anthology I Fire It Bleeds. He further warned us about the dangers of our miniature screens. John Lee Hancock's adaptation of that story, currently streaming on Netflix, attempts to demonstrate King's themes in one of the opening scenes of the movie. For example, we are introduced to a high school cafeteria where the students are segregated not by their social standing or personal interests but by their phones. In one corner of the room sit the Samsung kids, while in another other area of Father Hull City iPhone owners, and there are several other phone-related groups, with each student sitting glued to their screens instead of having actual FaceTime with the people situated around them. One student is Craig Jaeden Martell, who begins his first few weeks at high school without a phone. He feels as if he is missing out as a consequence, but when he is later given an iPhone as a Christmas present by his widowed dad, he starts to wish he had never been given such a device in the first place. This isn't because he succumbs to phone addiction or online bullying, but because the elderly gentleman that he befriended several years earlier and kindly gifted a phone to starts to send him messages. These texts would appear to be quite harmless, but as Mr. Harrigan Donald Sutherland, the gentleman in question, now dead, Craig's life is upended when he realizes the deceased fellow is communicating with him from beyond the grave. Not only that, but the ghost of Harrigan, or whatever he has now become, is also wreaking vengeance on the people that have upset Craig. How is Harrigan doing this? Well, the movie doesn't really explore this aspect of the plot. These might be disappointing if you were expecting a fully fleshed out ghost story, as director Hancock has given us a movie that is quite abstract in nature, or with a bigger focus on Craig's bond with the Harrigan and subsequent grief. Then out and out horror as such. This isn't a movie laced with bloody scenes of vengeful terror or jump scares to make us drop our PH1s in fright. While it does touch on the supernatural, the writers of the movie are more interested in themes of loneliness, friendship, and the evils of technology. It doesn't particularly matter that the film isn't scary, as these is more a character piece about our troubled young teen and his friendship with the elderly billionaire of the title. However, for a film that hinges on the premise that Harrigan can cause bad things to happen while lying 6 feet under, the film could have been a little more horrific. Horror fans are going to be disappointed with this one unless they lower their expectations in preparation for a movie that is far less gruesome than most King and adaptations. Martell, who is no stranger to the world of Stephen King after taking a lead role in Chapter 1, is perfectly believable as the sensitive young boy whose life takes a strange turn after his elderly friend Sutherland gives a believably performance too, as the crotchety old man who has a seemingly dark past this never are fully explored, and who forms an unlikely bond with Craig after he hires the young lad to read for him. Together the two actors do much to paper over the weaknesses in the script, such as the occasional plot hole and lack of decent resolution related to information located halfway between the coming-of-age nostalgia of Stand By Me and the horror content of nearly every other Stephen King-derived movie. Mr. Harrigan's phone ends up too mild on either count to make a memorably impression. Still, John Lee Hancock's adaptation of the same named novel, which led off King's 2020 collection if a tabloids, handles the rather thin saucy material adeptly enough to make for an entertaining middleweight drama dingy with the supernatural that premieres on Netflix October 5th, getting Halloween month off to a moderately creepy start. Craig Colin O'Brien is still a child when his mother dies of cancer in 2003, leaving him alone in his main small town with an equally bereft father. Joe Tippett is a welcome distraction then when his scriptural recital in church attract the attention of Mr. Harrigan Donald Sutherland. Our billionaire financial tycoon has retired to this nondescript burg in order to spend his twilight years out of father spotlight. His eyes are failing, so he offers Craig regular after-school gig of reading aloud from literary classics, starting rather inappropriately with Lady Chatterley's Lover, but sooner embracing Dickens, Conrad Dovey, and so forth. The arrangement suits both parties fine, and while Mr. H is our reserved old-school gent, they soon enjoy one another's company. The older man is fond of including lottery tickets with their holiday cards when Craig, now a teamer played by Jaeden Martell, scores a $3 a win. As thanks, he gifts his benefactor an iPhone such as he himself has recently gotten. It is politely declined by the allied recipient till he realizes he can't get stock tips a lot faster online than by waiting for yesterday's Wall Street Journal to arrive not long after Harrigan dies of natural causes. As a sentimental gesture toward the bond between them, Craig slips that phone into the open casket at the funeral service. Until this point there's really been no other worldly aspect to the story, like Hancock tries to work around by applying some basic superfluous gothic atmospherics as well as ominous notes from Jaeden and a variety score. Sutherland is directed to play his role somewhat more imperiously than it's drawn in the book, and a montage of newspaper clipping suggests Mr. H could be a fierce and a malicious foe when crossed during his career heyday. Nonetheless, he isn't meek as a figure of fear, so it's not terribly as spooky when Craig, using his late mentor as an imagined voicemail conf, I don't get to the occasional cryptic response on his own cell. Dad dismisses the phenomenon as a prank by someone who's hacked the older man's phone. However, when our protagonist suffers abuse at the hands of a school bully Cyrus Arnold, then grievous harm befalls a beloved teacher, Craig angrily calls upon his late friend and lethal justice is promptly mysteriously delivered. King's Tower Ale feels stretchy to thin even at its original 90 pages, coming off as an extended anecdote sense and much weight. It's also weakened by a narrator's voice that sounds an awful lot like a boom roth rather than our 21st century youth, particularly in their emphasis on Gwiz the technology these days stuff. Apart from a stretch that feels too much like an Apple commercial promoting the joys of a younger generation, introducing grandfatherly oldsters to the interwebs, Hancock manages to downplay those elements with some finesse, but he remains faithful enough that the film never really builds much suspense or mystery. Sutherland does not reappear as a senior variation on his ghoul at the end of Philippa Kaufman's Great Invasion of the Body Snatchers version 44 years ago. However, or whatever his character is capable of, far from the grave remains a murky and no too especially interesting, given that their victims are certifiable bad guys won't deserve it. Their fates mostly are kept off-screen, nor is Craig's remorse after each demise very compelling, no more so than his pleasant if blandly sketched relationships with dad, a first girlfriend Thorough, or a supportive high school instructor Kirby Howell-Baptiste. The results balancing over a familiar warm and fuzzy growing up gay and half-hearted horror revenge tale evaporate quickly from the mind, throws a little cumulative force that might linger, yet at the same time Hancock does an admirable job keeping this hour and 3/4s polished and engaging and maintaining consistent viewer interest, even if the ultimate reward underwhelms us in any flamboyant turns to his well-cast actors, length, era, characters, look, naturalism, including our primarily sedentary Sutherland and that a hulking bully, while the presentation I say handsome in a straightforward non-flashy way. If at first glance Mr. Harrigan, a man's exterior, strikes a retro sinister old dark note, production designer Michael Canby's interior is none the less impressed with the old guy's excellent taste. DP John Schwartzman's imagery makes good use of attractive locations, though it appears upstate New York and Connecticut are standing in for. Maynard here best known for liberally dramatized inspirational biopics The Bright Side, The Rocky, Saving Mr. Banks. Writer-director Hancock demonstrates no particular feel for thriller mechanics, although Mr. Harrigan's PH still works better within that general framework than his ponderous serial killer police procedure or The Little Things from last year. This latest may not rank among the best screen Stephen King adaptations, but Jaeden knows it's nowhere near the worst. The mostly quiet adaptation of Stephen King and Mr. Harrigan's phone is underscored by a distracting and familiar sound to that desperate posted scrape of the large barrel of stories he's written as studios searching for third and fourth tier books to be dragged to the screen, an ungainly process that only serves to highlight the author's weakest spots. Recently we've shrugged our way through Pablo Larraín's visually arresting yet otherwise uninteresting Apple series Lee story The Dull Adrian Brody led weight based on Jerusalem's El Otterdam remake of Firestarter, a story that was never that interesting to begin with, and a now thinly plotted 88-page short story becomes a bloated 106-minute Netflix movie, competently made yet utterly inconsequential pre-Halloween time waster. It's stuck in that awkward place here between two well-trodden king subgenres, small-town coming-of-age and small-town supernatural, never quite connecting as either too silly to be an involving drama and too subdued to be a creepy horror, in a hope to sway some of the millions who made it Chapter 1 the most commercially successful King and adaptation of all time. It made a still rather staggering $700 million worldwide. Star Jaeden Martell is recruited as head kid again, this time playing Craig Tina, living with his father in a small town in Maine. He's taking us back via voice over through his relationship with local millionaire Mr. Harrigan Donald Sutherland, who hired him as a kid to read out loud as his sight disintegrated. Over the years the pair become closer, and when Craig gets some money of his own, he treats Mr. Harrigan to his first earphone. When Harrigan then dies, his addiction to his new phone extends beyond the grave, with Craig still receiving calls and cryptic texts. When people start dying, Craig begins to question who he was at friends with. It's kind of befuddling why something as aggressively pedestrian as this would attract the attention of our horror hit makers Blumhouse, Ryan Murphy as producer, and The Blind Side and the founders John Lee Hancock as our writer-director. The mystery of what would lure them in proving far more haunting than anything the film comes up with. Stretching a relatively short novel to a full-length feature is too often our fool's errand, and Mr. Harrigan's phone bears the hallmarks of the very worst, most pointless examples: a lumbering pace, poorly developed characters, and absence of plot dialogue that feels as if it's been slowed down just to pad it all out, and so anything that might initially intrigue ends up frustrating her. Instead, perhaps if Hancock had picked our tone and stuck with it, things might have felt a little smoother, but has never able to figure out what he wants us to feel as a horror thriller. It's woefully ineffective and curiously underexploited for us to care in between. The languid back and forth between the two genres Hancock tries to stuff in asymptotal deep commentary about our over-reliance on technology, which I say about as complex as someone looking around at everyone on their phone and shaking their head in dismay. Phones bad, books good, okay, and for someone as Twitter literate as King, it all seems a little tired. It's solidly acted by Martell and Sutherland, although the latter seems as desperate as we are to let loose and have a bit more fun, and has a confident sense of fireplace as King adaptations often do, due to its all rather unforgivably dull color to be swiftly ignored. More details of Harrigan's phone film, while Stephen King is often remembered as the King of Scaser the Masters. Horror books are anchored in deeply emotional human relationships, from classics like Carrie to new successes like Outsider. King's most beloved stories chill us to the bones because they deal with real trauma, social exclusion, and loneliness. The nightmarish images King evokes wouldn't hit us so hard if they were not manifestations of real demons that hunt us all every day. With Harrigan's phone, King puts horror on the back burner to tell a coming-of-age story about morality and friendship. There are still supernatural elements sprinkled all over Mr. Harrigan's phone. The novel is more concerned with the interior universe of its protagonist Craig than with ghost stories. The very nature of Mr. Harrigan's phone imposes some serious challenges for a movie and adaptation, while Mr. Harrigan's phone is our memorable story that forces us to confront the ugly things we sometimes wish for other people. The novel is our slow burner with no significant payoff. As such, Mr. Harrigan's phone is not exactly a cinematic specifically for viewers looking for a new spooky experience. While there's enough dread in Craig's story, Mr. Harrigan's phone still leans more heavily into drama than a horror, and it's precisely in this somewhat uncomfortable position that Netflix's adaptation of the novel stands. That's because Netflix's movie is our faithful adaptation of the original work with all its limitations, and while writer and director John Lee Hancock is an experienced filmmaker, we can't help but feel that some of the magic got lost in the translation from written text to film. Netflix's Mr. Harrigan phone stars Jaeden Martell as Craig, a kid who gets hired by the reclusive billionaire Harrigan Donald Sutherland to read books out loud to him 3 times per week. In his old age, Mr. Harrigan cannot trust his eyes for reading anymore, which leads him to employ Craig under his service. Martell, already a horror expert after it and the lodge, knows how to bring a teenager to life with all the confusion and ambition that surround you. All at an early ages. For Sutherland, his version of Mr. Harrigan is the perfect portrait of a cutthroat capitalist man who doesn't hesitate even for a second to destroy other people if that gets him what he wants. For almost 1 hour, Mr. Harrigan's phone explores the bond between these two characters and how an unlikely friendship is born from their fateful meeting. Mr. Harrigan's phone is at its peak when it lets its cast flex their dramatic muscles to create a touching story of found family beside us. So that once the titular phone is introduced and Craig begins to teach Harrigan about the wonder of the modern world, the movie is also highly successful in unraveling the complex relationships we forge with technology. While smartphones are wondrous tools for communication that literally put the world in the palm of our hands, they also tend to absorb our attention and alienate us from the outside world. Moreover, smartphones are symbols of our status capable of recreating the rules of social interaction, especially for a teenagers entering high school final year. As a somewhat period piece set in the early 2000s, Mr. Harrigan's phone is also a curious study of a time not so long ago when smartphones were not yet too essential everyday tools. While it's fascinating to watch Mr. Harrigan's phone here as a drama about generation difference, things get a little messy when the supernatural outlines of King's story start to show up in the movie as are promised by every marketing piece from Harrigan's phone. Mr. Harrigan will die at some point, and Craig will keep somewhat connected with his old friends going through their smartphones. However, this connection doesn't take the spotlight, as Harrigan's phone remains a coming-of-age story even when spirits cross into the living world, and that's when the by the book's approach of Netflix's adaptation fails to capture the tension of King's novel. When Craig first suspects Harrigan might still be around, the supernatural elements are underplayed as a series of coincidences. It takes a tragedy for Craig to reach out to his old friend with dire consequences for the living, and nonetheless Mr. Harrigan phone is originally a meditation on growing up, how with the weight of death hanging over your head, and about how dark thoughts could have horrible repercussions if we ever had the power to make them our reality. But these reflections just work better in a book than in a movie, because a story based on internal turmoil does not translate so well into images. So once Mr. Harrigan gets out of the picture and Craig loses his partner, keeping the story going without hiccups is challenging even for an actor such as Martell. That's aggravated by how the supernatural promise gets in the way of the audience enjoying the coming-of-age story, especially because Mr. Harrigan's phone will never become as scary as our horror fiends hope. Despite its flaws, Harrigan's phone remains a careful adaptation of one of King's most touching stories to date, and while there are not many frights in this horror movie, it remains a solid entry of Netflix's enviable collection of King's and adaptations. Even if a less faithful adaptation could make the story fit best of the film format, Mr. Harrigan's phone is still worth a watch for those willing to ponder mortality, morality, and how there's no absolute good or evil. When I first heard about Mr. Harrigan's phone, I was so intrigued. I want you to read the same synopsis that I did before I start. We and Craig, a young boy living in a small town of Jaeden, befriends Mr. Harrigan and an older reclusive billionaire Donald Sutherland. The two begin to form an unlikely bond over their love of books and reading, but when Mr. Harrigan sadly passes away, Craig discovers that no to everything is dead and gone, and strangely finds himself able to communicate with his friend from the grave through the iPhone. And there's a supernatural coming-of-age story that shows that certain connections are never lost. Now the first thing you think of is that this is going to be a supernatural type film, something similar to classic 2000 film Frequency. The problem is that it is not in any way remotely is the last line of that synopsis true. I think the film has been slightly missold. I understand it is based on an 88-page novel by Stephen King, which I have not read. My issue is not so much with the film itself. I actually found the film to be very watchable and enjoyed it. My issue is that it is not really what it is advertised as. The film is more of a coming-of-age story for the Craig character that is played by Jaeden Martell. There is no real horror element, there is no real supernatural element. The communication with the dead Mr. Harrigan is more of a therapeutic complaining by Craig and a couple of nonsensical text messages, and then some coincidental deaths that Craig either asks for or were karma if these happened in real life and was examined from a critical standpoint. Everything could be explained in the end. The film tries to hit on a few points about a technology living on your phone, the consequences of event, and so on. But when you hear Stephen King, you kind of want more, and I think if this film would have taken a few liberties with the short 88-page novel it is based on and instead went full on in one direction or another, it would have been much better either as a horror film or as our supernatural one. Instead it is just a nice drama, few information about the film and eerie meditation on our relationship with technology. Leave it to Stephen King to craft an interesting, unconventional narrative tackling death. Hadn't thought it may be rated PG-13. Mr. Harrigan's phone has some bite by way of its creepier staying power and THRW over the viewer. Super producers Jason Blum and Ryan Murphy work with writer Director John Lee Hancock, the founder of The Blind's idea to focus on coming-of-age drama and life's big questions over goopier extravagant horror narration from our lead Craig Jaeden Martell. Stephen King's At the Lodge constantly keeps us in his headspace. A dash of the supernatural brings King's short story to life amidst the stylish haunting shades of realism. We first meet these characters in 2003, a Harlow, Maine, wherein a young Craig Colin O'Brien connects with elderly Mr. Harrigan on Sutherland. The Hunger Games is swimming with sharks after the boy catches his eye during church service. He is the richest man in Maine and an apparent billionaire. Hagen's eyesight is beginning to fail him. He hires little Craig for $5 an hour to read books to him at his mansion inside the home. Style is old and elegant, but nevertheless connecting with Harrigan is a highlighter of the week for Craig. Each time he sits in Harrigan's study, both Craig and his father Joe Tippett, mayor of Eastertown, are still recovering from his mother's death. Harrigan seems to give the boy a newfound sense of purpose. The film flashes forward 5 years and Craig, now played by Martell, is more entwined in the world of Mr. Harrigan than ever. Each time they sit together 3 times a week to be precise. We are given the title of whatever book the YR reading from Lady Chatterley's Love It'd Be Anderson and Bonda. Harrigan gifts Craig with numerous lottery tickets on special occasions, yet none of them appear to be winners. As Craig starts his first day of high school, he immediately realizes that without owning a cell phone he exists so now the fringes of new societal norms. He begs his father for a phone to help him fit in at school. An annoying bully simply refuses to leave Craig lonely, and a Christmas rolls around. Hagen's gift winds up a lottery ticket that turns Craig a cooler $4. While his dad finally gifts Craig with a brand new iPhone. Of course, having a phone for the first time opens up a whole new can of worms that Craig's teenage brain may barely be able to comprehend. While many people take advantage of the opportunities that having a cellular device at his fingertips provide, rarely do we actually take a moment to appreciate the many conveniences and necessities that phones help us with in the modern age. King explores not only what this means for Craig but also how Harrigan reacts to this noteworthy shift. Using part of his lottery winnings, Craig buys Harrigan our phone. To initially resistant Harrigan embraces the idea. The more Craig makes it seem appealing with the world at Owen's fingertips. What could be better? Their meetings suddenly evolve a bit. Now each time Craig comes to read a book, he also introduces Harrigan to new features on his phone. When Harrigan has our breakdown about what this could mean for spreading false information and fake news, he basically predicts where the technology has taken us to in this era of instant reactions and quick cancellations. The crux of the tale does not unfold until the moment Craig walks into a mostly empty mansion and discovers Harrigan's dead body clinging tightly to his phone. My heart broke for Craig as he must experience the second major loss in his young life. In the throes of his grieving, Craig texts Harrigan one final time saying that he will miss their conversations. As tears slide down his cheeks, Craig leaves Harrigan's cell phone in the pocket of his jacket at the viewing of the body, delivering it to its final resting place. After the funeral, Craig is told that he will be hearing from lawyers in a couple of weeks and is given a final letter to him from Harrigan. A chill went down my spine as Craig reads Harrigan's final words, which include that Harrigan will miss their conversations. Too bizarre indeed, considering that Craig only texted Harrigan this after he had passed on sooner. Enough cryptic texts come off from Harrigan's handle. Pirate King tying technology into the film along with our dash of supernatural horror. John Lee Hancock was certainly not the first choice of director I would have envisioned for this project. However, Hancock does an exceptional job of sprucing up what already existed on the page. Craig and Harrigan's friendship may seem a bit weird, but the kindly rich grandfather vibe present in King's text is pushed to newer heights in cinematic form. Sutherland and Martell play off one another well as they chew through contemplative layered dialogue as Craig approaches big high school moments like a first dance, college applications, and eventually college. The mysteries surrounding Hagen's otherworldly connection loom large. Those coming for only the horror element may leave a bit disappointed, mainly because Mr. Hagen's phone never manages to go full tilt stereotypical scary. However, I personally became very invested in Craig thanks to Jaeden Martell's immersive charismatic perform. Ant and King's potent commentary. Our phones are what tie us into the world of today. So what happens when they follow us to our afterlife? The concept personally chilled me to the bone and made me reflect on my own relationship with cell phones. The next time anyone close to me dies, the error number is respectfully getting blocked. Either Mr. Harrigan's phone rings for audiences around the world when it debuts exclusively on Netflix on Wednesday, October 5th. Since October is the season when horror and Halloween take center stage, streaming platforms like Netflix have plenty of reasons to cater to horror fans. One way Netflix is doing that this year is with another adaptation of a Stephen King story. Netflix has actually been a fairly successful home for King adaptations, previously releasing films such as In the Tall Grass, 1922, and Gerald's Game. Of those, Gerald's Game is easily the strongest. Like In the Tall Grass and 1922, Mr. Harrigan's Phone is based on one of King's novels. While there are several things I enjoyed about the film, I also think some choices make it difficult to recommend to general horror audiences. The story follows a young man named Craig, played by Martell, who befriends a stern elderly billionaire named Mr. Harrigan, portrayed by Donald Sutherland. Craig works for him by reading books aloud, and over time, the two develop a genuine friendship. As their bond grows, Craig introduces Mr. Harrigan to the modern world by teaching him how to use a smartphone. Not long afterward, Mr. Harrigan dies. Deeply saddened by the loss of his friend, Craig decides to place Mr. Harrigan's phone inside his coffin so that he can continue calling and texting him. During one of these calls, Craig talks about a bully who has been tormenting him. When the bully is later found dead, Craig begins to suspect that Mr. Harrigan may have returned as a vengeful spirit. A couple of years ago, the Highwayman filmmaker John Lee Hancock also turned to Netflix with his revisionist take on the Bonnie and Clyde legend. That film was another case where the premise and cast seemed stronger than the overall execution. Unfortunately, I had some similar issues with Mr. Harrigan's Phone. That doesn't mean the movie is a complete failure. I genuinely enjoyed parts of it, and I thought its ending served as a fairly natural stopping point for the story. However, the biggest problem is that the film never delivers a satisfying horror payoff. The story feels somewhat bland because it doesn't take its supernatural premise in particularly exciting directions. At times, I couldn't help but wish the film had gone all in with something closer to Death Note or Final Destination. Instead, when the movie finally gives its supernatural concept some momentum, it quickly pulls back. That decision ultimately weakens the story and prevents it from reaching its full potential. The acting, however, isn't the problem. Martell and Donald Sutherland are both excellent, and their conversations are easily the strongest part of the movie. Their chemistry gives the film a surprisingly emotional core. On the other hand, Mr. Harrigan's speeches about the dangers of smartphones can sometimes feel overly didactic and a little too obvious. The basic Stephen King premise is genuinely intriguing, but writer-director John Lee Hancock doesn't add enough meaningful ideas or bold horror developments to make it truly memorable. After Mr. Harrigan's death, the story feels like it should have gone much further. That said, the movie does work reasonably well as a coming-of-age story with a subtle supernatural element. The problem is that because the supernatural storyline never receives a satisfying payoff, it's difficult to recommend the film as a horror experience. Film details: directed by John Lee Hancock, written by John Lee Hancock, produced by Ryan Murphy, Jason Blum, Carla Hacken, starring Donald Sutherland, Martell, Joe Tippett. Cinematography: John Schwartzman. Edited by Robert Fraser. Music: JV. Production companies: Blumhouse Television, Ryan Murphy Productions. Distributed by Netflix. Release date: October 5, 2022. Running time: 106 minutes. Country: United States. Language: English. So, friends, that was our review of Mr. Harrigan's Phone, 2022, along with some additional information about the film. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking the video, and sharing your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching.